blocked Earth from the stars, so we brought Zeus online to fight back. 3 warships died every 4 seconds, and nobody had fired a single shot. Over-Commander Malacca stood on his command deck and watched the sky tear itself apart. Bronze hulls that had blockaded 100 worlds before this one buckled under white light that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. No missile trail, no boarding party, no fighter wings screaming out of a launch bay. Just the light, sudden and total, and then the ship was gone, and the tactical wall updated its count with the flat indifference of a machine that didn't know it was supposed to feel something about what it was doing. 4,000 old satellites, the kind his own survey teams had logged as dormant junk decades ago, the kind nobody in the Directorate had looked at twice in 30 years, had turned the space above Earth into a killing field. Nobody on the Oronix side understood how yet. That was the part that would stay with his officers long after this day was done, the part that would surface in the middle of other operations, in the quiet between one order and the next, the moment when a commander looked up at an unfamiliar sky and wondered what it was hiding. Malacca's obsidian skin caught the arcs of dying light and threw them back in fractured white. He was 8 feet of cracked stone and interlocking bronze plate, 12 conquest crests hammered into his ceremonial armor, and he had never once in his career stood on a command deck and felt the specific, hollow sensation of having no move left to make. He felt it now. Below him, past the smoke and the drifting scrap that used to be a fleet, the planet kept turning. Blue and quiet and indifferent, exactly as it had been before he arrived with 180 ships and an ultimatum and the full bureaucratic weight of the Sovereign Directorate behind him. He had read every trade report Earth ever filed, 35 years of paperwork, every export manifest, every tariff dispute, every complaint some regional council had lodged against a neighboring system. He had read all of it and built a perfect mathematical picture of a species that was manageable, containable, compliant in all the ways that mattered, and he had never once asked what they kept off the books. A junior officer's voice cracked over the comm, asking for evacuation orders. The question was technically correct. It was also 3 minutes too late for the ships it was meant to save. Malacca didn't answer. He was doing math in his head, the same math that had never failed him in 12 conquered sectors, and for the first time in his long service to the Sovereign Directorate, the numbers refused to add up to anything that made sense. 3 more ships blinked off the display. I wish I could tell you it ended there. It didn't. Stay close. 3 weeks earlier, the Apex concourse hummed with the particular quiet of a room that already knew how it would vote. The concourse was a moon-sized administrative station that floated at the exact gravitational balance point between 3 major systems, and it had been doing that for 9,000 years without anyone finding it remarkable. It was sheathed in pale blue atmospheric panels that made everything inside it look like the bottom of a very old ocean, and the chamber at its center seated 40,000 representatives from across the Directorate's governance reach, though on most days not all of them bothered to show up. Today they had. Word had gotten out that Malacca was on the agenda, and when Malacca was on the agenda, people came to watch. Chronicler Zephyrus sat in the high tier with his back very straight and a data slate he wasn't looking at resting across his knees. He was 600 years old, and his skin had the look of beaten silver leaf, thin, delicate, prone to catching light at odd angles. His job, technically, was to record proceedings. What he actually spent most of his time doing was watching the faces of delegations, because in 6 centuries of service, he had learned that the faces told you more than the words ever did. He was watching the human delegation. They sat in the gallery below, 2 of them, a woman and a man in plain dark clothes that looked like they'd been picked for their ability to be forgotten. Every other delegation Zephyrus had ever watched in this chamber, every species that had ever been called before the Assembly to answer for trade violations or resource shortfalls or compliance failures, had arrived wearing some version of performance. Fear dressed up as confidence, anger dressed up as restraint. The practiced, careful mask of a species that knew it was being evaluated. The humans weren't wearing anything. They sat with their hands folded and said nothing and looked at nothing in particular, and Zephyrus found that he could not stop looking at them. Over-Commander Malaka took the plinth. The rooms settled immediately, the way rooms do when someone steps into them who has never once had to ask for quiet. The Sol sector has failed every trade compliance audit for 6 consecutive cycles, he said, and his voice carried the particular flatness of a man reciting facts he found neither interesting nor debatable. Under Directorate Charter, I am authorized to declare a full economic encirclement of the human home system, effective immediately upon ratification. An administrator in the third row half rose from his seat, more out of habit than conviction. He asked whether the Sol delegation had been given an opportunity to formally respond to the audit findings before the encirclement motion was brought to a vote. It was a procedurally valid question. Malaka looked at him the way a wall looks at you. They were given 6 cycles, Malaka said. Silence is a response. The administrator sat back down. The vote wasn't close. The final count was 387 in favor, 12 opposed, and the 12 who opposed did so quietly enough that nobody recorded their names. Zephyrus recorded them anyway. He had a habit of recording the things nobody thought to write down. Throughout all of it, the human ambassador's face didn't move. Not when the motion was read. Not when the first vote was called. Not when the final tally came in and the chamber broke into the low, satisfied murmur of a body that had resolved something efficiently. Beside her, the second delegate leaned close and said something too quiet for the tear to hear. The ambassador shook her head once, a small movement, and folded her hands again. Zephyrus made a note on his slate that had nothing to do with the official record. Malaka didn't wait for the ink to dry. That was not his way. He had spent 4 decades in Regency service, developing a doctrine based on the observation that the most effective form of pressure was immediate and total. No warning window, no grace period, no space between the decision and the consequence for a target to adapt. Within 2 hours of the vote, 180 bronze dreadnoughts folded out of transit space along the edge of the Sol system and locked into a grid formation so precise it looked like it had been drawn there. The formation was a standard Regency containment array. Each hull was positioned at the exact distance from its neighbors required to cover every viable exit vector without overlap. There were no gaps. There were no weak points. The Oronix had run this same grid against 63 other systems, and it had never failed to achieve compliance within 90 days. No merchant vessel crossed the boundary. No subspace transmissions went out or came in. Every local asset was tagged, catalogued, and flagged for systematic resource restriction. The Regency's economic containment doctrine was, in the words of its own technical manual, airtight. 300 kilometers beneath the Canadian Shield, in a bunker that had been excavated during a war nobody currently alive had fought. Director Alina Mercer sat at a console's guard by 35 years of other people's emergencies and didn't move when the first alarm lit red. She was built like a granite pillar, not tall but dense, the kind of solid that makes a room feel smaller when you walk into it. Her hair was iron gray, cropped close, practical. She was 58 years old and had spent every one of those years in deep space military infrastructure and fallback logistics, which meant she had spent most of her career preparing for things that everyone around her hoped would never happen. She was drinking cold chicory out of a glass tumbler that nobody had washed since the previous crisis and probably wouldn't be washed before the next one. She set it down without looking at it. Her eyes were on the tactical wall, 12 meters wide, floor to ceiling, currently showing 180 red icons arranged in a perfect sphere around the Sol system's outer perimeter. She pulled the frayed collar of her command coat tight against the bunker's damp chill, adjusting the empty threads where a brass button used to sit. The button had been gone 11 years. She'd never replaced it, not because she couldn't, but because the coat still worked, and things that still worked didn't need fixing. "Grid's locked," said Commander Cole Sterling from the next console. He was rubbing the old scar across the knuckles of his left hand, a habit he'd had since before Mercer knew him, the kind of thing the body does when the mind is too busy to fidget properly. 18 years in telemetry. He read threat signatures the way some people read weather. 180 hulls, evenly spaced, zero gaps. That's not a blockade. That's a cage. Ledgers close, Commander, Mercer said. Cages open. Sterling looked at her like he wanted to ask what she meant. He'd learned, over the years, that asking rarely made it clearer. Dr. Karan Patel sat at the far end of the room, surrounded by screens that were showing him things the main tactical wall wasn't. He was 44 years old and wore an oversized emerald wool sweater that had been faded to something closer to grey, and he had the particular focused stillness of a man who has just found something in the data that he wants to make sure he's reading correctly before he says it out loud. Their flagship, he said, parked itself directly over Waste Station 9. He pulled up a secondary overlay. Decommissioned orbital dump. Been offline for 20 years. I'm not sure they know that's what it is. They ran a full asset survey before deployment, Sterling said. It's in their own filed reports. They catalogued it as a defunct civilian platform. Right, Patel said, adjusting his sweater. Defunct. They will know, Mercer said, and didn't say anything else. The first full data lock came in clean. 180 hulls, static, grid alignment stable, engine emissions holding at idle. Patel cross-referenced the emission signatures against 3 separate historical profiles and got the same result each time. A fleet that had settled into position and fully committed to it, with no variance that suggested any commander was keeping an evasive option warm. They weren't watching for a counterattack. They were waiting for paperwork. Then the comm chimed, and Malaka's face filled the auxiliary screen, bronze and obsidian, and utterly certain of the outcome of this conversation before it began, and he did not bother with a greeting. Mercer picked her chicory back up. She took a slow sip, set it down, and waited for him to finish his opening line. Director Mercer, Malaka said, my clerks have prepared a compliance ledger. You will sign it, transferring administrative control of Earth's orbital shipyards to Regency custodianship. You have 15 minutes. Mercer set the tumbler down on an old operations folder, careful not to leave a ring on the cover. You flew 180 ships across half the galaxy to hand me a piece of paper. I flew them to demonstrate what happens to systems that choose not to sign. I've read your demonstration record, Mercer said. You've run this same play against 63 systems. You know what all 63 of them had in common. Malaka said nothing. They all filed clean manifests, Mercer said. Everything declared, everything visible. You ran your audit, you found your leverage, and you applied it. That's a very efficient system for the kind of species that shows you everything. She paused. You've read our manifests. You know our export figures down to the last decimal point. You built a cage out of what we were willing to tell you. Another pause, shorter. You checked our charts, but you never checked our tolerance for cages. Malaka's jaw didn't move. His voice stayed level, the flat, patient tone of a man who has heard variations of this speech before and knows how they end. Your economy cannot survive a closed border for 90 days. The math is not in dispute. The math is fine, Mercer said. It's the variables you're missing. The screen went dark on his side first. He never waited for final answers. In his experience, they were never necessary. Sterling exhaled slowly through his teeth. 15 minutes. That's what they're giving us. It's enough, Mercer said. Patel looked up from his screen. The fleet's engine outputs haven't changed since they locked grid. Not a single variance. They've committed to the position fully. No one up there is keeping a hand on the throttle. Mercer nodded once, looking at the tactical wall. The countdown ran. Sterling read the minutes in a flat, even voice, more to anchor himself than to inform anyone else. The junior technician 2 seats down had given up pretending to work and was just watching the clock. Nobody in the bunker spoke much. There was nothing useful left to say that the wall wasn't already showing them. At 0, the auxiliary screen lit red, and Malaka's voice returned, reciting penalty clauses in the same level tone. the next page in a document he'd filed before he ever opened a channel. Mercer didn't let him reach the second clause. "Initiate Project Perseus," she said. It was quiet enough that only Sterling and Patel clearly heard it. Patel's hand was already on the console. He struck a single key. For 2 seconds, nothing visible happened. Then the floor moved. Not a tremor, not an earthquake. Something deeper than that below the register of sound, a pulse that came up through the bedrock and through the bunker's reinforced floor and through the soles of everyone's boots and into their bones, like the planet itself had taken a breath after a very long time of holding it. The empty chicory glass walked itself to the edge of the console and fell. Nobody caught it. "Sterling," Mercer said. "I'm seeing it." His voice had gone careful, the way it went when the readouts were showing him something outside the parameters he'd spent 18 years memorizing. 4,000 platforms on the deprecated satellite registry are all reporting simultaneous status changes. Internal housing rotations. They're moving. "What kind of platforms?" the junior technician said before he could stop himself. "Old weather monitoring array," Patel said, without looking up. "Originally deployed for atmospheric modeling, decommissioned from active service 30 years ago when the new orbital network came online." He paused. "Or so the filed records say." "They were never dead," Mercer said. "They were dormant." Above them, 4,000 satellites shifted their internal magnetic housings at the same moment, tilting on axes that weather monitoring equipment had no engineering reason to have, and locked onto the bronze hulls hanging in the sky above them with a precision that the Regency's own survey equipment had never flagged, because nobody in the Regency had ever thought to look for it. On the Oronix flagship, a junior sensor technician named Disick was 3 hours from the end of his shift when his console made a sound he'd never heard before. He'd been in Regency service for 6 years. He'd served on blockade deployments in 4 systems. He was not, by his own assessment, easily startled. But the sound the console made was outside the normal range of alert tones, which meant the instrument had registered something outside the normal range of conditions. And for a half-second, he assumed the equipment had malfunctioned, because equipment malfunctioned constantly on long-deployment blockades, and the alternative explanation was one his brain wasn't ready to process. Background radiation across the entire grid had spiked by 90,000% in under 4 seconds. The number was still climbing. It wasn't the instrument. The space between the fleet's own ships was changing. He could see it without the readouts now, a faint violet shimmer threading through the vacuum between hull and hull, subtle enough that he might have missed it if he hadn't been looking directly at the forward camera feed. It moved like something alive, building density in the gaps, weaving through the exact spaces the fleet's own gravimetric anchoring system was designed to hold clear. Beside him, senior technician Vera, who had served 3 sectors longer than Disick, had been alive, and who had the calm of someone who had seen most varieties of bad news, looked at the same feed and went completely still. She didn't say anything. That was the part that scared him. He keyed the emergency channel. "Command, this is Sensor Deck 3. We are reading a subspatial charge buildup across the entire formation. It is not originating from outside the grid. It is coming from the planet." On the command deck, Malaka received the report and looked at his own external feeds and felt the thing he had not felt in 12 conquered sectors. Not fear, exactly. He didn't have the right architecture for fear. Something colder than that. The specific sensation of a variable that wasn't in the model. "Disengage," he said. "Pull the fleet back to jump range." "Sir," the helm officer's voice was steady, professionally steady, the kind of steady that is work. "The grid won't release. We're anchored. Something has locked the formation in place, gravimetric in origin, but the shape doesn't match any configuration in the database." "Override it." "We're trying, sir. The field is sourced from below the planetary surface. We don't have a countermeasure for a field coming from inside a planet." The violet light thickened. Somewhere aft of the command deck, an ensign started praying in a dialect Malacca hadn't heard spoken since childhood. He didn't order the ensign to stop. The first arc left the satellite grid and found a hull. It didn't look the way weapon fire was supposed to look. There was no beam, no projectile, no clear origin point. The space between the satellite and the ship simply stopped being empty and became something else. A channel, a connection, a momentary bridge of hyperspatial energy that existed for less than a second and left the hull's defensive shielding reading 0 where it had been reading full a breath before. The ship's reactor failed 6 seconds later. The hull followed 4 seconds after that. Second hull, third. The pattern held. One arc every few seconds, each one connecting a satellite above to a ship below, each one efficient and impersonal, and without any of the drama that Malacca associated with combat. There was no drama here. There was only the grid working through its list. Malacca gripped the command rail and watched his formation dissolve. The captains were breaking rank now, not on his orders but on their own, each one making the same calculation and arriving at the same conclusion, that any position was better than this one, that movement was better than stillness, that anything was better than sitting locked in perfect formation and waiting for the next arc to find them. They were wrong. The gravimetric anchor held every hull in place, regardless of how hard the engines pushed, and the energy expenditure of fighting the anchor was depleting shields faster than the strikes themselves. One cruiser attempted to use its ramming prow against a neighboring vessel, hoping the collision would create enough local distortion to break the anchor. The anchor held them both. They burned together. "Sir," the helm officer said, and stopped, because there was nothing useful to append to the word. Malacca looked at the tactical display. The count was still falling. 3 hulls every 4 seconds. The math was no longer in dispute. He thought, in the absence of anything more productive to think, about the trade audits. 6 cycles of compliance failures. He had read every document Earth had ever submitted to the Directorate, every export figure, every resource declaration, every infrastructure assessment. The weather satellite network had appeared in those assessments. Deprecated, offline, maintained at minimal power for atmospheric legacy data only. He had read that line and moved on, because deprecated infrastructure wasn't a threat vector, and a species filing detailed decommission reports on its own outdated equipment wasn't a species hiding anything. He had been reading the right documents. He had been asking the wrong questions. The violet light found the flagship's outer hull. The impact threw him against the command rail hard enough to crack the bronze ceremonial plate along his left shoulder and send a fracture line across the obsidian of his right cheek. He held the rail through it. His bridge crew went silent not from panic, but from the particular quiet of people whose screens have stopped giving them information they know how to use. Malacca straightened. Plate cracked, cheek scored, one of 12 conquest crests broken loose and hanging from a single rivet. He looked out through the forward viewport at the pale blue planet below and understood, with a clarity that his doctrine had never budgeted for, that this had never been a war. Wars had 2 sides. This had been a pest control procedure, and he had been the pest. "Get me a channel to the surface," he said. His voice, for the first time in 12 conquered sectors, was not entirely certain that anyone would answer. The channel opened. Mercer looked at the screen, at the cracked plate and the pale score across his cheek, and said nothing while he found the words. "Call it off," Malacca said. "It isn't a weapon I can call off," Mercer said. "It's a maintenance cycle. It runs until there's nothing left flagged as a threat in the target zone. There are people on these ships." "There were people on this planet," she said. "You gave us 15 minutes to sign paperwork about that." The channel held for another second, long enough for Mercer to watch something change in his face, not break, exactly. More like a load-bearing wall meeting a force it wasn't built to handle and deciding quietly which way to fall. Then the feed cut from his side. The tactical wall kept counting. No warning, no pause, No acknowledgement that the thing dying in the sky above Earth had ever been anything other than a grid coordinate and a threat signature. 3 hulls every 4 seconds. The satellite grid didn't negotiate, and it didn't show mercy, and it didn't take calls, and every hull still holding position in the formation above registered as a target, and so the grid kept working through its list. In the bunker, nobody spoke. Sterling had stopped calling out hull counts somewhere past the 100 mark and hadn't picked it back up. Patel was logging data in the steady, automatic way of a man who knows that the moment after is going to require records and is making sure they'll be there. Somewhere in the formation, a captain named Orerath Van spent the last 9 minutes of his life trying to raise a channel to a home system that was too far away to help him, and would receive no transmission from him explaining how he came to die here, orbiting a planet he'd never visited, inside a containment grid he'd helped build. His daughter was 12 years old and was, at that moment, in a classroom on a Regency world 3 sectors away, learning a history that did not yet include this day. She would get a notification and a folded crest, and she would never know that the last thing her father did was key a communications channel that no one on the other end thought to answer. The grid finished its work in under 9 minutes and went quiet. Malacca's ship held, damaged, listing slightly on its port axis, shield array gone, hull scored and breached in 3 places, but structurally present. Of the 180 ships that had formed the Sol encirclement, 6 remained. He gave the withdrawal order without ceremony. No final broadcast, no formal closure of the engagement record. Just a heading, away from the pale blue planet, through a debris field that 3 hours ago had been the finest blockade formation the Oronix Regency had ever deployed. In the bunker, Patel reached down and picked the chicory glass up off the floor. He turned it over in his hands once, checked the base for cracks, found none, and set it upright on the console edge. Then he went back to his readouts. Sterling watched this and didn't comment on it. Grids returning to standby, Patel said. All 4,000 platforms confirming status hold. They think the threat's cleared. They'll remember the calibration, Mercer said. Every targeting parameter they just ran, every hull signature. They built that into the system so the second deployment takes half the time of the first. And if there is a second deployment? Sterling asked. Mercer looked at the tactical wall, which was now showing 6 retreating icons moving steadily away from the Sol perimeter toward the outer transit corridor. Then it takes half the time, she said. She picked up the chicory glass and drank the last cold inch of it that had been sitting there since before she gave the activation order, and set it back down on the folder and looked at the wall and said nothing else. Sterling rubbed the scar on his knuckle. Outside the bunker, 300 kilometers up through solid bedrock, and then through the long, cold dark of space above it, 4,000 satellites sat in perfect standby with their housings still warm and their targeting memory intact, waiting with the patience of machines that had been built to wait and had spent 3 decades proving they were good at it. 3 weeks later, Director Alina Mercer walked into the Apex concourse alone. No escort, no delegation, no prepared remarks on a data slate. She wore the same command coat she'd been wearing in the bunker when she gave the activation order, frayed at the collar. Grease-stained at the left cuff from an engine service she'd done herself 18 months ago because the facility's maintenance queue was backed up, and missing the brass button at the 3rd fastening, the one she'd never replaced because the coat still worked, and things that still worked didn't need fixing. The concourse chamber was full. Word of what had happened above Earth had reached every system in the Directorate's reach within 72 hours of the fleet's withdrawal, because the Directorate ran on information, and this was the kind of information that moved fast. Nobody had agreed yet on what to call it in the official record. The preliminary filings described it as an engagement and a defense incident, and in one document that Zephyrus had read 3 times, because he couldn't decide if the author was being precise or ironic, a resource reclassification event. 387 representatives had voted to authorize the encirclement. They were all present today. So were the 12 who had voted against it. Zephyrus, from his place in the high tier, noted that the 12 were sitting differently than the 387, not straighter, exactly, but as though the weight they were carrying had shifted to a more manageable position. The chamber was completely silent when Mercer walked down the center aisle, not the procedural quiet of a session being called to order. The other kind, the kind a room makes when everyone in it is waiting to see what the person walking toward them is going to do. She stopped at the speaker's rail. She didn't set down a document or open a data slate or arrange papers or do any of the things that speakers at that rail typically did before beginning. She let the grease-stained cuff of her coat rest over the rail's edge and looked out at the chamber, 40,000 seats, most of them occupied, and didn't say anything for long enough that the silence became its own kind of statement. The missing button faced the crowd. "You sent 180 ships to collect a signature," she said. "You're going to get one condition instead. Earth is removed from every ledger the Directorate maintains. No trade audits, no compliance cycles, no resource assessments, no encirclement authorizations, no inspections of any class conducted by any Directorate-affiliated body at any distance. You built your governance structure on a principle of total visibility, every species accounted for, every resource catalogued, every asset declared and made available for assessment. That principle no longer applies to us." She paused. "We are done being counted." The chamber didn't react immediately. 40,000 representatives who had been in that room for the vote 3 weeks ago sat with the weight of what she was describing and found that none of their standard responses fit it correctly. Zephyrus was the one who spoke. He didn't raise his hand or wait to be recognized. After 6 centuries, the procedural habits had become automatic, but right now the procedure felt beside the point. "And if the Directorate declines the condition?" he asked. Mercer looked up at him, and something happened in her face that was not quite a smile, thinner than that, and colder, and directed not at him specifically, but at the room as a whole, the 387, and the 12, and the administrative staff, and the chroniclers, and every representative from every system that had voted on what happened to Earth without once asking what Earth was capable of. "Then you already know what's still parked above our atmosphere," she said. 4,000 platforms didn't return to storage when the last Regency hull left orbit. They returned to standby. There's a difference. The maintenance cycle is complete. The targeting memory is intact. The calibration from the first deployment is still running." She let that land for a moment. A second deployment would be faster. No warning, no mercy, no opening for a procedural counter-motion. Nobody in the chamber called for a vote. Mercer turned from the rail and walked back up the center aisle. Her boots struck the polished stone floor in a rhythm that didn't vary, didn't slow, didn't acknowledge the 40,000 people watching her go. The grease stain at her cuff caught the blue atmospheric light as she passed under it. The missing button faced forward. She did not look back. At the doors, without turning, she said it. "You locked the gates to the sky," a half step. "We just built the storm." The tall doors opened, and she walked through them, and they closed behind her. In the high tier, chronicler Zephyrus sat for a long moment with his data slate across his knees, not writing anything. Then he opened a new record, gave it a date and a session marker, and began the log entry. He wrote, "The sole delegation appeared before the full assembly today. The delegation consisted of 1 representative. She did not bring paperwork." He paused, read it back, decided it was accurate, and saved it. Beneath the Canadian shield, 4,000 satellites held their standby positions with their housings still warm and their targeting memory intact. The grid didn't know what had happened in the Apex concourse. It didn't know about the vote or the withdrawal or the condition Mercer had placed on the rail. It only knew what it had always known: the shape of a threat, the geometry of a target zone, the specific calibration it had run once and would run again if it was asked. It was not asked. It waited, the way it had always waited, patient and ready, and completely without opinion about the length of the silence. The housings stayed warm.